Good morning. I might have to say good afternoon also. My name is Harley Crowshoe. I'll be the moderator for the forensic examination webinar. And just want to share a little bit of myself. Uh, my Blackfoot name is Gayupika. It's in English, it's Bear Child. I come from the Piikani Nation, which is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy in southern Alberta. Uh, I guess a little bit of my background, I have a little bit of policing, justice, health, and community leadership, and been involved with the National Advisory Committee with the National Center Truth and Reconciliation for a number of years. Today, we're going to focus the webinar on, forensic examination, and we have a number of presentations that are going to be very, very important and with the information that we need that's going to help us on the search of finding our missing children, the ones that never came back from residential school, so I'll mention a little bit more about the presenters in a minute here, but I'd like to sort of just say the land acknowledgement. I'm calling from my ancestral territory, the Blackfoot Nation, but a lot of us are calling from many places on Mother Earth, and just take the time to acknowledge the people that were here before you, and the people and their traditions and their customs, and a little bit about them, so that we can really recognize and respect the land that we live, play, and work on. But on behalf of the National Center Truth and Reconciliation, you know, uh, they're located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, in the Wak, Dakota Oyate, and Dene, the homeland of the Red River Métis, and the home to many Inuit. And excuse me if I sort of mispronounced it a little bit. I'm not familiar with the territories and the nations in that area. And I just wanted to share a few of the housekeeping notes. The topic that we're going to be talking about today is important, but it can be triggering. And there's times when we, might feel a little bit of the emotion, or we might, be struggling a little bit. So, I would like, share that, you know, there's an opportunity to call the Hope for Wellness helpline, which is 1-855-242-3310. Well, and or the National Indigenous Residential School Crisis Line, which is 1-866-925-4419. And at times we'll show it on the screen or also on the chat line if you need to, connect for some of that health support. In regards to your preferred language, it's if you want to hear the interpreter, click the original audio, mute audio, and I believe at the corner of the screen there is a interpretation icon, the globe's symbol. Just click that on and just click your preferred, whether it's English or French, and you should be able to get the webinar on the language that you need to for clearer understanding. The webinar is being recorded and you will be available on the NCTR YouTube channel. And the information is going to be provided by the presenters. There's an opportunity to ask questions, a Q&A, and we will, at the end of the presentations, we'll be able to answer any of the questions. So we'll just hold off on those questions and then just send them through at the end so we can, get the respective presenters to be able to respond. And at this point in time, I'd like to welcome Elder Jackie Bouvier to open the session in prayer and ceremony. And I'm just so thankful to be able to, hear what the prayers that Jackie has, because, she is one of our, circle of survivors and has so much knowledge and just really appreciate you coming and being able to, open the session in a good way. So we'll pass it to Jackie.
Thank you, Harley. I'm a visitor at the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I have cedar bundle that was presented to me. I'm going to say my prayer in my language, which is Cree and Michif, and then I will say a few words in English. Gitsamanatu, Witsihinan, Umakamamuyapia. Kakyo awasakitse, Umakaitutama. Igomina, Kimashumnanak, Kukumananak. Ta apetseki watu. Koeste spaikuma, Kamamoyapia. Creator, we come to you today asking for your guidance, wisdom, and support as we begin this meeting. Help us engage in meaningful discussion in this important meeting. A moment of silence, you can pray in your own way. Merci. Ekuse. We're done.
Okay. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for your prayers. And there's, for the moment of silence, we need to, it's so important to do that. And it's to, strengthen our spirit and prepare ourselves. So the next part of this is I'd like to sort of just share a little bit of what we're going to talk about. So the topics will be, analysis of skeletal remains, perspective, and methodology. The next topic will be process of death investigation and role of the forensic pathologist. And the last topic will be DNA component, data privacy, and sovereignty. And I'd like to sort of introduce our first presenter, who is Emily Holland. And just give me a second here. My screen seems to be a little bit, there we go. Just having difficulties with the screen, but I think I got it back. So our first presenter will be Emily Holland, who is a forensic anthropologist and a professor in the Department of Anthropology, Brandon University, Manitoba. She has contributed to numerous investigations involving Indigenous communities, including work with the RCMP, First Nations Police, grassroots organizations like Drag the Red, and recently she was the forensic anthropologist and search director for the humanitarian search for the Prairie Green landfill, where the remains of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron were successfully recovered. Emily specializes in the recovery and identification of children's remains and is affiliated with the Canadian Society of Forensic Science and the Canadian Association for Biological Anthropology. So she'll be talking, as I mentioned earlier, analysis of skeletal remains, perspective, and methodology. So I'll pass it on to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Harley, for the introduction. And I want to say a heartfelt thank you to Jackie for your prayer and opening this work. It feels good when you pray. Thank you. I'm just going to give me 1 second to share my presentation. All right. As Harley mentioned, the importance of the land acknowledgement, and he acknowledged a lot of the peoples that are in Manitoba as well, as the NCTR is based in Manitoba. And I would just like us take a second to kind of second that acknowledgement, because I'm actually not from here. I'm not from Manitoba, but I'm also not from Canada. I was born in England and we emigrated here in 1983. So I consider myself actually very fortunate to live on these lands and to benefit from all the teachings from Indigenous people I've had in my life. And so I really have a deep appreciation and sincere recognition of all the people that have come before and all the connections I've made throughout my time in Manitoba. The point of my presentation today is to speak about what we can actually learn from the skeletal remains of children. And I do want to acknowledge that this is a difficult thing to consider. And I really want to emphasize that excavation and exhumation can only happen at the request of the communities and the families. It has to be a decision that they want, and if that is what people want, and they want to excavate or exhume individuals from a cemetery so that they can return those children home, there needs to be a pathway forward for them to do so. But I really want to stress the importance that decision solely rests with families, survivors, and communities. When we talk about skeletal analysis, really what we're trying to do when we work with individuals is generate what we call a biological profile. So those demographic characteristics of someone that help us figure out important things about them, such as how old were they when they died? Are they male or female? It gets a bit more complicated for children because some of those traits that we use to identify biological sex don't manifest until much later. One thing that can be very helpful is recording dentition and any potential dental work that the children might have. And this can be useful, but of course we know that there are limited dental records and little dental care for children. It's also possible to assess for the evidence of disease or evidence of trauma, but I have to be very clear here that this is only things that affect bones. And it might then be possible to link this information to medical records that can help you figure out who it is that you're working with. So I'm going to go through all of these in a bit more detail. One of the things we need to think about when we talk about age assessment is what age categories we're referring to. So the individual on the screen is my son, Charlie, at 6 months and at 4 years. So you can imagine that there's a huge difference between the development of him both biologically and mentally in these two pictures. So when we think about splitting people up into age groups or age categories, these are biologically and developmentally meaningful. So we have fetal, so they're not quite born yet, maybe not full gestation, infants, birth to 3 years, children 3 to 12, and adolescents 12 to 20. And then we have our older categories for adults. So these first 4 categories are the ones that are most important when we're thinking about residential school children. One thing that's important when we consider these things is that each of these age categories uses different kinds of age estimation methods because of the differences in biological development. The best age assessment method is using teeth. Teeth actually start developing in utero. So even though you might have a young child and they don't look like they have any teeth, they do have developing teeth in their jaws. Dental development is under strong genetic control, and there's limited impact from stress or from the environment that they're in, so that it accurately tracks chronological age. But there are population differences. And if you are going to assess age from individuals, you need to try to make sure that you're using the population-specific dental development and eruption sequence. The image on this screen is a multi-populational database that was created out of University College London. And it has a number of different populations, but most of them are European. So this doesn't necessarily reflect individuals of Indigenous descent in Canada. It's also possible to assess age based on features of the skull. And this is common in really young children, infants especially. This is based on how the bones of the skull grow and fuse, because we have expected stages of development of these bones at specific ages. So we can look at the length of certain bones of the skull and age at death, or to estimate age, and the ratio of length to width. Pars basilaris, that's just a fancy word for part of the bone at the base of the skull, which is indicated in this upper image here. This one. And also fusion in age. So when do certain parts of the bone fuse to each other? An example of that is the temporal bone, or the bone, the left and right side of the skull, essentially around your ear. When these parts fuse together happen at specific ages. And so they can help us get an idea of how old young children are. It's also possible to look at the postcranial skeleton, anything below the head. We can do this by looking at the length of long bones. So physically, if we look at this image here, you can imagine it makes sense. As a child gets bigger, they're older. And so this really small bone is fetal. As they get bigger, we can see it increase in size, and we can link this to age. But maybe what you've also noticed is that these bones don't have clear joint surfaces. That's because those joint ends, or epiphyses, fuse much later after the bone has finished growing. So that fusion is called epiphyseal fusion. And again, there are strong timelines associated with that and age. And again, known standards. The thing, though, that's really important about using long bone length to estimate age or epiphyseal fusion is that are affected by stress. So when we say stress, we're talking about physiological stress. So were the kids in some kind of malnutrition situation? Were they exposed to a heavy disease load? Was there anything else in their life that was potentially impacting their immune system? When that happens, what the body does is it reduces growth to ensure it's devoting its energy to survival. And as I'm sure you can imagine, children at residential schools were probably in a very high stressed situation. We know that there was limited food, poor nutrition, high disease load. And so all of those things actually affect stress or affect growth. So one thing that's particularly useful is if you estimate age by how their bones are growing versus age based on their dentition will give you a good idea of how old they are. Their bones might make them seem younger than they should be. And that actually tells you that they were in a stressed environment. So this gives us a sense of their life at the time of their death. Sex assessment is particularly difficult for juveniles. There is new research happening to help figure this problem out. But we have established methods for adults. But we have limited accuracy for methods in children. And this is because the secondary sex characteristics that we use to establish biological sex based on skeletal features don't tend to manifest until that child is going through puberty. That means then the best way to assess sex in kids less than 15 is by DNA. Trauma and disease can also be established from the skeleton. But as I mentioned in the introduction, it's only those things that can affect bone, and the person has to live with that condition long enough for the bone to respond to the stress or disease that it's under. As an example, tuberculosis can affect bone, but it is also possible to die quickly from a tuberculosis infection. So this is an acute cause of death. And in those kinds of situations, there's not enough time for the bone to have been involved in tuberculosis at all. So if you die quickly from tuberculosis, it's not going to be in your skeleton. But if you have tuberculosis and it goes into remission, it's called secondary tuberculosis, and then it stays with you for a long period of time, which is actually common in children, then it will manifest in the bone as well, and we can see that in skeletal remains. Another example is influenza. It's a common cause of death, especially in kids, but it does not affect the skeleton at all. So there's this kind of myth in assessing skeletal remains where you look at a skeleton of somebody and you can say, oh, there's no evidence of any kind of disease, therefore they must have been healthy. That's not necessarily true because they died for some reason, right? And it's about parsing out what that reason might be, even if there's no evidence on their skeleton. It's also possible to assess trauma. And when we talk about trauma, really what I want to talk about are fractures. Children are actually at a high risk of fracture or injury due to their size and to their body composition. So they don't have the same muscle structure as adults. Their bones are not as dense, essentially, but also they're just smaller. So they, in modern context, they're more likely to get hit by a car because people don't see them. That's the whole reason we have reverse cameras in cars. But what we need to remember is because their bones are not as dense as adults, they're a lot more plastic, so a lot more flexible. So even if a child is injured, that injury might not cause a full fracture because of that high plasticity to their bone. They also tend to heal a lot quicker than adults. An example of a common childhood fracture is something called a green stick fracture. And this is called a green stick fracture because if you can imagine, if you break a green stick off a tree and you push it with your thumbs, It's going to break on that top edge, opposite from where you're pushing the force. But it's not going to break completely through the bone. And that's actually what you can see here in this arm. So this is the forearm of a child. This is the radius for the bone near the thumb. And this is the ulna. And you have two fractures here. These are both green stick. They have not passed completely through the bone. And you can also see how they're a little bit deformed. They actually look bent. That's because that plastic deformation in the bone is happening in the process of that fracture. One thing about fractures that is helpful in assessments of child skeletal remains, and this is hard to consider, and this is something I have to do as a forensic anthropologist in Manitoba as well, is determine if there are fractures that are at different stages of healing. Because it might be that a child has healed fractures, and it can be common in cases of child abuse that these are in the ribs, but also evidence of fractures that happened more recently. So then that can give us information about ongoing trauma. So previous abuse situations and then ongoing abuse as well. Going back to tuberculosis for a minute, infants and children are more likely to contract tuberculosis than adults. And we do know, and it's in the records, that tuberculosis happened throughout residential schools in Canada, and that those children were sent to sanatoria. Sometimes they recovered and came back to the residential school. Sometimes they were sent home sick. And then sometimes they died, and there's very little record. But trying to track those children from residential school to sanatoria and then past is quite difficult. But when a kid does contract tuberculosis, it can spread to kidneys, the brain, the joints, and in kids, the spine, the hip, and the knee. Those bones associated in those parts of the skeleton manifest change as a result of that bacteria from tuberculosis. And it destroys joint cartilage and bone. If you look at the image on the screen, this is the knee. So this is the bottom of the thigh bone. This is the top of the shin bone. This kind of empty area here that you see is evidence of tuberculosis. So the bacteria has actually eaten away at the inside of the bone. It is possible to identify tuberculosis in the skeletal remains of children, both through X-ray and through observation of skeletal remains. It is also possible to identify the presence of tuberculosis using aDNA or ancient DNA. You take a sample of bone, and the bacteria, the DNA of the bacteria is what is being looked for, not the person's DNA. Also particularly relevant to residential school contexts are evidence of nutritional deficiencies, such as vitamin C. A lack of vitamin C causes scurvy, which is defective bone growth due to deficient collagen. Your bone is made up of collagen as an organic component and mineral component as well. What happens in these situations, because the collagen is deficient, there's more bone being added to the long bones or the jaw, for example, because the muscle is pulling on the bone, but the collagen isn't very strong. And so the bone is responding, thinking it's in trauma and adding additional bone to try to provide stability. Vitamin D causes rickets, which is visible as bending of the tibia in this X-ray. And this is a result of deficient mineralization. So that mineral component of the bone is not very strong. You have a lot more bending because there's more collagen and less mineral. It's also possible to identify iron deficient anemia based on small porosity in the skull. In addition to using bones to identify nutritional deficiencies, it's also possible to look at the teeth to identify what we call enamel defects. Your enamel grows incrementally over time, developing in your jaw until those teeth erupt. And you can have periods of reduced enamel that can look like pits or lines or furrows here. And these happen while that enamel is growing. So there's something stressed in the environment. Maybe the kid is in a nutritional state or under disease load, and the enamel cannot form properly. So it reduces how much enamel is placed on the tooth, and you get these lines of less enamel. The thing that's really important about enamel is that it does not remodel. It does not fix itself. Your bone, on the other hand, is constantly remodeling and fixing itself. But teeth are a permanent record of malnutrition or stress during childhood. And it's possible to link that particular line of reduced enamel to the age at which the child developed it. It's also possible to extract stable isotopes from teeth and bones to help answer questions about the child. I've included a screen here or a slide here on what stable isotopes are, because it's something I have to relearn every time I talk about it. So a stable isotope is a variation in a chemical element. I have a little picture, hold on, there it is. So you have the same number of protons, so this is carbon, they all have 6 protons. So they have a different number of neutrons. So carbon 12 here is 6 protons and 6 neutrons, it's stable. Carbon 13, 6 protons, 7 neutrons, it's also stable. Carbon 14 is what we call an unstable isotope or a radioisotope, and that it degrades over time. So the thing about stable isotopes is they do not degrade. Once they're in the bone or in the tooth, they stay the same over time. So you can compare what's in the bone to the environment. This can be particularly useful in the context of children if we're trying to figure out who they are. It can help us determine place of origin. So strontium is a stable isotope that occurs in bedrock. It varies across Canada based on the bedrock, or across the world, I should say. And this is absorbed into plants, into animals, and then into humans. And as it's being absorbed into your body, it replaces a little bit of the calcium that's in your bone. So, because it doesn't change over time, the strontium in your bone matches the strontium in the environment. So there's a baseline that's established, and then you can determine that baseline in the environment and compare it to your individual, and you can tell if they're from there or they're actually from somewhere else. So the strontium in teeth happens while those teeth are growing, and teeth don't remodel. So it's strontium from where they grew up. Whereas we're talking about strontium from bone, that's strontium from the area that they were most recently living in. The same thing applies to oxygen. Oxygen lives in water, it's a component of the molecule, and the levels in bone reflect the water that was consumed, usually within the last 10 years of life. And the oxygen in teeth is where they were living at the time their teeth were forming. So if we have a child that's living, for example, in northern Manitoba, and they're growing up there, and then they move to southern Manitoba to go to residential school, we'll have a difference in oxygen, and we'll be able to figure out where they came from. But in all cases, stable isotope analysis is destructive. And that's something that needs to be considered. So when we think about the skeletal analysis, what are the potentials that we can do with it? One, age at death can help narrow down who it is we might have based on archival records. Dental assessment and assessments of disease and trauma can potentially be linked to dental and medical records if they're available and if we have access to them. And this can actually help identify an individual. Trauma and disease assessments can possibly assist in the determination of cause of death. And I say possibly because just because someone has a broken arm doesn't mean that's related to their cause of death, but also just because their skeleton doesn't have something doesn't mean they didn't die of a soft tissue related disease. We can look at identifying nutritional deficiencies, which can be linked to poor quality of food and life. We might not find anything in the skeleton. We have to be very careful to be cognizant of the fact that you might learn very difficult information and what they experienced. And this is a highlighted screen because I think these are important points to emphasize. The community who is determining the exhumation or excavation needs to decide what they want to know, and if it's possible to know that. If you don't want certain information, you don't have to have it. Who is going to do the work? It is important to have people that have experience with infants and juveniles. Who is going to have access to this information after the fact, and how will it be shared? Will families be able to visit or conduct ceremonies during analysis? And it's really important to establish clear expectations and protocols before any work is done. And I know Jeanette and Thomas are going to speak to DNA, but I just wanted to highlight a few things to think about. Identification of children may only be possible through DNA because we don't have dental records for a lot of kids. The analysis is destructive. We actually have to remove teeth and bones to do so. And it requires DNA from living relatives or communities through a cheek swab or a blood sample. So the things that I think are really key, and I know Jeanette and Thomas will speak to these, are who's going to do the analysis? Who's taking the samples from living people? And then how is that information stored or shared? And who has access? Not only is it important that communities make decisions for themselves about what they want to do, but that they retain the sovereignty over the information generated. Thank you so much for the time, for your time, and for having me here today. Thank you to everybody I have on this screen, the National Advisory Committee and the Circle of Survivors. And if you would like my contact information, it's here for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. The information you provided was, very well needed, and certainly a lot of the information provided, really helps me too, understand a little bit better, and also, the area where how important the dental is, but also, once we get to that point where we're looking at DNA, the things to consider. Thank you for that, and we'll probably have more questions as we continue on future. So I just want to remind everyone that if they need wellness support, that the number for the Hope for Wellness helpline and the National Indigenous Residential School Crisis Line is on webinar chat page. And then also, if you are needing interpretation, please select the interpretation button, which is that globe at the bottom, and select the language of your choice, English or French. And if you have any questions, please hold them till the end of towards the end of the webinar after the last presenter. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kona Williams, and I'll share a little bit of who she is and what she's currently doing. So Kona Williams is a Cree and Mohawk and works as a forensic pathologist and coroner. She serves as the First Nations liaison for the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service, a director of the Northeastern Regional Forensic Pathology Unit in Sudbury, Ontario, and co-chair of the Indigenous Health Committee, Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. Kona has extensive experience in investigating violent and suspicious deaths and providing expert testimony in court. So she's going to cover the topic of process of death investigation and the role of the forensic pathologist. So thank you, Kona, for being here and sharing your knowledge. So I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Harley, and thank you to Jackie as well for, the prayer in the beginning, and to my colleague, Dr. Holland, for her presentation. It's a perfect lead into what I'm going to share with you now. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. So thanks, Harley, for the intro. I am a forensic pathologist and a coroner, and I will explain what those terms are, and a bit about the death investigation system and sort of what we're facing when it comes to looking for children who attended residential schools. I just, for those of you who do need supports, please make use of them. I promise I'm not going to show any uncomfortable pictures, but I will be discussing death and sort of what an autopsy is. And I also just want to remind everybody that what I'm talking about isn't scary, but it can be triggering. So please keep that in mind. So when people think of death investigation, this is probably one of the first things that comes up. What people see on TV versus what actually happens in real life is very different. But again, I mean, anybody who finds out what I do, they almost immediately ask about CSI. And on TV, it's the death investigation moves very quickly. I mean, they do have there is a lot of drama. There is quite a bit of everything's sped up, and so it looks like things get solved within a nice hour or 40 minutes or however long the show is, but things take longer for death investigation, and for something for this kind of investigation, when you are likely going to be dealing with bones, that process can take quite a long time. There's a lot of steps that need to be done. We have to do things very carefully, as Dr. Holland explained, and then following any exhumation or any examination from a forensic perspective, there is still identification using DNA. So that will, be a good segue into the next talk as well. So death investigation in Canada, each province and territory has its own, which means that there is no federal oversight. There's no federal standards. So it's a bit of a challenge when the residential schools were run by the federal government in part, but the death investigation system is run by the provincial governments, and so they're all different. But at least in Canada, there are two separate systems. There's a coroner system and there's a medical examiner system. And these are the ones, so anything in red is a coroner system. So I am in Ontario, and so we do operate under a coroner system. Other places, Alberta, Manitoba, out east, they have medical examiner systems. And, there's various historical reasons for why this happens. And one thing to note is in the far north, so in the territories, they do have coroner systems, but there are no local, like on-site forensic pathologists to do autopsies in the north. So anybody who gets a forensic autopsy, the body will need to be sent down south to Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta. And unfortunately, because many of the provinces are so big, it typically, if somebody is found dead or dies in a small, remote flying community, for example, it can take a while to transport that person to a regional center to receive a forensic autopsy. So again, there's the time component. These things don't happen overnight, although we do try to accommodate as quickly as we can. a little bit more about what the systems are in Canada and who are sort of the players. So in Canada and in Ontario specifically, we have a coroner system, and these systems are old. They originated in Britain, and this system is 1,000 years old, and it's certainly evolved over the centuries. But these positions are government appointed. And they may be medical doctors. In Ontario, they are. So coroners are actually medical doctors. But in many places, they're lay people. So, in some places, you just really need to have, not having a criminal record and, have a high school diploma. And that's changing. But the training to become a coroner, there may be no training at all. But it could be, a short course running for a few days. So, depending on which province you're in and depending on what system you have, there's a variation on the skills and experience, of the person who is the first person investigating the death. So if you think about how death investigation starts, anybody can call a coroner or a medical examiner if they come across somebody who's died. Typically, the first responders will be there, so the police or the paramedics, and then they will likely call the coroner or their medical examiner, and then that is your liaison between the family and the death investigation system. Medical examiners are different. Medical examiners are medical doctors. So they're all medical doctors, and they're forensic pathologists trained like me. The system originated in the States, so it's pretty new, but the training is much longer. So for me, I did a undergrad, so I did 4 years of that. And then I did medical school, which is another 4 years. Then I did 5 years of pathology residency training and a year of forensic pathology fellowship. So it's a very long time in order to become a medical examiner or forensic pathologist. So it's quite a difference in training there and experience. But at the same time, whatever system you have, regardless, the coroners and the forensic pathologists will try to work together and get the best possible outcome for the family. So a little bit of word about pathology. Most people don't even know what this means. And pathology is actually it literally means the study of disease. Forensic pathology takes it a little step further. And we do all know all those things. So we know all about diseases, but we also interpret that in the context of the legal system. So this is why it's forensic. So out of all the specialties, the medical specialties there are, forensic pathology is probably one of the closest to the legal system, and there are legal implications into what we do. So if somebody dies unexpectedly or under criminally suspicious circumstances, that is the lead into the forensic system. And there's, always sort of a legal flavor to that. So for example, if somebody dies and they've been killed by somebody else, so if we call that a homicide, that will likely go through the criminal justice system. So when people die under those circumstances, moving into the criminal justice system, part of what needs to happen is a good, thorough autopsy to get all the medical and scientific data to kind of work with that, with all the information, so that can progress. And just as a reminder, forensic pathology in Canada is actually quite small. There's not that many of us. There are training programs that have been running for the past several years, but it's one of the youngest subspecialties in medicine in Canada. Places like the UK or the US, they've had forensic pathology for decades, but in Canada it's actually quite recent. It's been around for not yet quite 20 years. So what do? We investigate deaths. So forensic pathologists, that's what we've been trained to do. We perform the autopsies, and when required, we testify in court. So we are able to testify in criminal court. We perform reviews. So other forensic pathologists, they might have a complicated case. We will review those to make sure that everything was done appropriately. We do teach quite a bit. I do a lot of teaching. And because the forensic pathologists in Canada are very, very well trained, we do provide international expertise. So we go outside the country and help others and give them the benefit of the training that we have. So again, just so that we know, the coroner is a physician in Ontario, at least. In other places that varies. The coroner is the first. So if somebody does die suddenly, unexpectedly, or under unusual or criminally suspicious circumstances, the coroner is your gate person to the death investigation system. So they're the ones that should be communicating to you the information about what's happening, what are the results of the autopsy, what are the next steps. So they have the legislative authority to order the autopsy, but the forensic pathologist is the one who will perform it. The coroner will write the investigation report and a death certificate. And so that is really important for families to have, particularly, if they're looking for compensation, for example, or, if there's estates or insurance, all of that, those documents are actually really important. Forensic pathologist, on the other hand, again, we're subspecialist physician. We do the autopsy and interpret all the tests. We write the autopsy report, and in coroner system, the autopsy report will flow through the coroner and then subsequently to the family. And again, we testify in court. And I think probably one of the main things to remember is that death investigation is not just done by one person. It's a team effort. So depending on what's happening, depending on what's required, we may have a couple of people involved. We may have all of these people involved. And considering the complexity and the magnitude of the residential school system and the burial sites, we're going to need quite a number of people involved in order to ensure that the process is as smooth as possible and as careful to get as much information as we can. And so for any death investigation, these are the questions we need to answer. And this is, this goes for anybody who died and either we don't know why or, there was some criminality to it. We need to know who. And again, that's going to be difficult, at least challenging when you're dealing with bones. So we need a lot of information about what happened to them in life, and then we need information about from them in death. And so who died is very, very important. Where did they die? And people may, have died where they were found, or they may have been died somewhere else and then were brought to the place, where they were found. When did they die? That's actually really challenging. So unless it was witnessed or recorded in some way, the when can be really hard. And when you're dealing with bones, that can be even more difficult. So we may not get, a precise time of death. It's not like what we see on TV. Then there's the cause and the manner of death. And these are important terms to get right, or at least as close to the truth as we can, because depending on what you want, what families and communities and nations want, these terms may be, not that important, or they may be extremely important, especially if you're considering, litigation. So the manner of death, you probably heard these terms before. So if somebody died in an accident or by suicide or naturally, homicide, so that means literally somebody taking the life of another person, or undetermined. And undetermined is difficult because it could be, well, we don't have enough information, or we really truly don't know what happened to this person. But technically, the medical examiner and medical examiner systems will determine the manner. In coroner systems, it is the coroner who determines the manner of death. The cause of death is very specific. So this is like your diagnosis. And so whatever the disease is or the injury or, a combination that led to this person dying, that will be the cause. But like I said, it's very, very specific. And it's, if you think about manner, manner is kind of more of a judgment call versus cause, which is very, very specific. Those two are very important to get right. And it's very important for, anything to come later if that's required. The mechanism of death is generally not included. It can help sometimes, especially if I'm in court and discussing things. But I really wanted to make sure that everybody knew cause of death and manner of death are the two big important terms to understand. An autopsy, what is it? We examine the body, and it's a very thorough examination. When you're dealing with bones, we will be working very closely with the forensic anthropologist because they are the bone experts. But working together, we go through the same basic sort of set of steps for every case, and how long it takes and how complicated it is depends on what's required. But these are the 5 basic steps to any autopsy. So we need information, and that's something that I think a lot of we don't really think about. But medical records, very important. Any circumstances about how this person might have died, where were they, who were they with, you know what was going on around that time. And unfortunately for many of these, the children that are missing, we may not have that. But medical records, I would think for a good number of them may be available. And so it would be very important for us to review those medical records to get an idea of what was happening in the life and death of that child. So, archivists in the archives, that's important. A translation even. So if a lot of these, records might be in French. So that would be important for us to understand. We look at the body and then we look inside the body. That's kind of what everybody thinks of as an autopsy. But afterwards, we have to interpret any testing that was done. And for children, if we do end up looking at them, that could be imaging. So post-mortem radiology, taking X-rays, or even CT scans. And then looking at working with the forensic anthropologist to determine what story is being told in the bones. And then identification. And then at this point, it's probably going to be through DNA. After all that's done, I come up with my cause of death. I make a report, and then that is flowed either to the coroner, through the medical examiner system, and should be provided to the family. So there's different phases of the forensic approach for this. This is obviously for those families and nations and communities that want to pursue a forensic approach or are thinking about it. Lots of communication has to happen. We have to involve lots of people so that we know what it is that you would like to know about how these children died. Like I said, archival documents, research, interviews, talking with people, reading the reports, reading any information that we have available would be hugely helpful. And, this is a good segue into the next talk, collection of antemortem data. So before death, from prospective families, so usually including DNA, in order to identify people. And again, it's a team. We got lots of people that are involved. There will be a good number of people involved in any exhumation. Even of one person, there's quite a large team that gets together to make this work. Identification and repatriation. So repatriation means, returning the bones or the person back to their community, and depending on what is asked for. Likely there are going to be unidentified remains, so bones that, for whatever reason, the DNA is too degraded, or we just can't with the technology we have, and so what to do with them is going to be a challenging question to answer. So to remember, there's likely going to be unmarked burial sites at all 139 recognized Indian residential schools across the country. So that's not a small, a small task. There are other schools and other sites that are not recognized by the federal government, which may also have burial sites. So those need to be considered. Day schools, hospitals, Indian hospitals, industrial schools, reformatories, day camps. I recently learned about a train that collected students. So even I'm still learning about what happened. And as we know, children are often moved around from different communities. They might have different names or just numbers, and so the records may not be that accurate. And so there's a lot of work to do ahead of time, especially with trying to find them. there's ceremonies and protocols and language and all this needs to be respected now, and the variations between them as well, which a lot of people don't really think about who are not from those communities or not involved with them, and those need to be respected, and unfortunately that isn't always the case when it comes to death investigation, but we're working on that. Communities and nations may have opposing views about exhumation. So exhumation literally means, you excavate the site looking for human bones. And what happens after that is, again, up to, the communities and nations and families. But what happens if there's children buried from multiple communities and there's very opposing views about how to proceed? That will need to be considered and discussed ahead of time. Your wishes are paramount. Our involvement at this point depends on what you want and what questions you need answered, and a very clear communication system between death investigation and the questions that need answered, so that people understand what the process is and what we need to do in order to answer those questions. There is a systematic approach to any type of work that we do. But at the same time, we can be respectful and, incorporate, the traditional values and ceremony and protocol. And there may actually be training available, or at least training opportunities for those of you who want to be involved or who want to learn. That's a big component of this that, I think we can do this. It is important to keep in mind that it might not be possible, it probably won't be possible to locate all grave sites and identify each child and determine exact cause of death. So keep that in mind in any discussion you have with the death investigation system. That should be clear the whole way through. There are lots of barriers to this. Unfortunately, most people don't really need to know or want to know about the death investigation system unless, it happens and the involvement occurs. The destruction and access to records, long-term funding commitments, there's the increase in violence and denialism. It's very important that any process have the trauma supports to ensure that people are not re-traumatized or over-traumatized, because this is a traumatizing process, or at least it can be. Access to sites, I mean, there's we can go on about this, but unfortunately there are barriers, and it is going to take a team approach to try and figure this out and determine the best way forward. And as I said before, existing processes are not always respectful, and that needs to change, and it can change. There are ways to respect Indigenous people and the ceremony and the protocols, and do a thorough and a good investigation. That is possible, but it does take time, and there will be opportunities for learning, I think, on both sides. So I think I'm just about out of time. Now on Miigwech, I've left my email down there, and in case anybody wants to get hold of me. So thank you again for the time, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kona. That's very, very informative. And yes, you are right. It is a team approach. There's many individuals that have different types of expertise and knowledge that's part of that team. But also, when we look at the team approach, it's being respectful, as you mentioned, and ensuring that our traditions and values are incorporated, the ceremony and the protocols, and working with our elders is so important. So, I just thank you for that. And being a police officer, I know that we really appreciate what you guys do, and the help that you provide and with that investigation. So thank you. We'll move on to the next presenter, but before that, I just want to remind you again that there's wellness support, and the Hope for Wellness helpline is on the chat line or the webinar chat page, and the National Indigenous Residential School crisis line is also there. So, certainly, if you need to give them a call, do so. Our next presenter both two presenters is Juliette Jules and Thomas James. And they're going to focus on, DNA component, data privacy and sovereignty. And I'm going to get them to share a little bit about who they are and a little bit of what they do and the expertise that they provide when helping the community in their search for the missing children and as Kona mentioned earlier, the communication lines need to be clear and understanding, and I know that's going to be part of what you're going to talk about a little bit because a lot of these areas are fairly new to our people. So I'll pass it on to both you, Juliette, and Thomas.
Like to apply them Jeanette Jules and Squext. Tecumloops to Sawapim. I'm Jeanette Jules from Tecumloops to Sawapim. I'm one of the managers of La Esqueque. The missing, our elders said that we all had numbers at residential school and they didn't want us to be using the 215. So they came with the Sawapim gene for the children, which is the missing. I'm a residential school. I went to the Kamloops Indian Residential School as a day scholar and as a resident. I physically lived at the residential school. I worked for our community for 32 years in all areas of education, right from preschool up to post-secondary. And then I was on council for 3 terms and had numerous portfolios, but one of them was legal justice and community safety. And I was on council when the news broke of the 215. And I'm a traditional knowledge keeper. I'm a pipe carrier. I was, despite residential schools, my grandmother and my other grandparents ensured that myself and my siblings were taught our traditional ceremonies, our songs, dances, our stetlahem, our truths, our spectacles, our oral histories, and all of the ceremonies. So despite all of those, I have that. I've been a pipe carrier for 47 years and have walked and continue to walk that path. And I will hand it over to Thomas before we start on our PowerPoint presentation.
And just might need to mute yours. Lot to see. Like to go quiet.
Okay, I'll come here.
Oh. Sorry, one second. All right, sorry about that. Let to seek white tip, Thomas James and Squelks, to Kamloops to Squamkas to Aquin. Good day, hello everyone. My name is Thomas James and I'm from Kamloops to Squamk. Yeah, I've worked in universities and colleges supporting our Indigenous students from across Turtle Island, providing financial, academic, and counseling services. Oh, and sorry, I forgot to mention I'm also the executive coordinator for Jeanette Jules and Fred Seymour. And yeah, I sat on numerous boards and committees advocating for and supporting our Indigenous students at institutional, provincial, and government levels. And just last year, I just completed my genetics program at Harvard Medical School, and I am just in my final year, still of my neurobiology degree at the University of Victoria. Yeah, it's really nice to see you all today.
Alrighty, PowerPoint. I'm just going to get to the PowerPoint. Okay, is it on screen? Okay, I had two of them going, so. Yeah, I gotta get to the share thing. Right there.
Yep.
But I gotta get on this one. And here's where's the share button?
Presentation right there.
Slideshow. Okay, is it online now?
Not yet. Would you like for me to screen share for you? This is Tessa from Tech Support speaking. Would you like me to screen share for you?
Yeah, and then I'll
Wonderful.
just do next slide.
Sounds good.
Okay, turn this off. Okay. Tecumseh La Esqueque investigation, bringing the children home with DNA analysis, and presented by myself and Thomas. Today, next slide. An overview. In this session, we will consider current status of TTS La Esqueque, the missing investigation, DNA analysis, a part of the Winnoxchinam, the truth-telling, and informed consent and community engagement, ancestral remains and DNA law, and collective rights to DNA, and next steps. Next slide. Tecumseh TTS is the people of the confluence and are the campfire of Tecumseh Nation, a historic caretaker unit of the Secwepemc Nation and holder of the inherent title and rights of Tecumseh Uluch. Next slide. Go ahead.
So last week, oh, my audience.
I'm probably gonna.
So last week we processed to date of the initial ground survey, GPR, has been done, and right now, oh, sorry, two initial ground surveys of the GPR has been done to date. And at the moment, we are in the archival and documentary investigation stage, as well as the Winnoxchinam truth telling. And that is what we're currently working on right now, and gathering all the information that we need before we move into the archaeological and forensic investigations. And from the beginning, the TTIS, the Tecumseh 13 grassroots families have stated that this is not an academic exercise. Next slide, please. And the expansion of Winnoxchinam truth-telling. More than 80% of children who attended Kamloops Indian Residential School, KIRS, were not from Kamloops to Secwepemc. We've had 108 communities and 38 nations that attended. And currently, we have, to date, we have 97 TTIS survivors. So showing in the circles here, we have the Tecumseh Secwepemc, and going to the blue is our Secwepemc and adjacent communities and nations, and on the outer ring there is other KIRS survivors and intergenerational survivors with information relevant to the investigation. Next slide, please. And last Squeakway investigation, preliminary findings of 215 potential graves anomalies in May 2021 with ground penetrating radar GPR. Confirmed survivors knowing about children lost to KIRS in the residential school system. TTIS role as caretaker, last Squeakway department, consultations and MOU between the four main nations, the Secwepemc, Incapemc, Statlium, and Seal, and participation in the National Advisory Committee and work of the Special Interlocutor. And in May 31st, 2024, was the signing of historic sacred covenant with the Roman Catholic Church. And our last weekly expert advisory team, which includes archival, forensic, archaeological, scientific, legal, and policy. Next slide, please.
And then I'll do. You got to turn yours down. Let us quickly investigation. So one Genome, the truth telling is survivor intergenerational survivor oral testimony, sharing truths about the children. Genealogy conducted by Secwepemc and other nation genealogists to record kinship connections. So we still have within all of our nations our traditional genealogists who know our family ties and connections to community, to each other, to community, and to nation, but also to other nations. Archival research, access to church sacramental records, NCTR, and the Royal BC Museum. Where we're at today is on the ancestral grounds of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and we are at a BC technical advisory meeting on Indian residential schools, and we're doing research at the Royal BC Museum. Further research. So forensic GPR, light detection and ranging, the LIDAR magnetometry, and soil spectropsy. We're going to look at all of those. There may be other tools out there, but that is one that we are looking at. And then on the advice of our expert team, we'll move forward with that. Archaeology, when locations of burials are identified with precision decision to exhume skeletal and grave site analysis. DNA sampling and analysis with willing living participants after potential exhumation with DNA from Laaskwekwe to identify the close matches that need to be done. Next slide. So the Laaskwekwe DNA analysis process that we're working on right now is stage 1, willing living participants. DNA sampling in community led by Indigenous genomic scientists as stewards, storage of genomic information in secure database, free, prior, and informed consent of nations, informed consent of participants. Contributing DNA is a way to participate in Genome, create a living DNA archive. And stage 2 of Laaskwekwe, sampling, ancient DNA analysis led by Indigenous genomic scientists, storage of genomic information, and secure database. Databases screen against each other to determine close matches. Genealogists from TTS and other nations to work with families to reconnect and to repatriate. So just on part of that, once we start getting the sampling of the willing living participants, we, on the advice of our experts, will need at least 14 terabytes of external storage in order to store all of that. And then we'll need another 10 terabytes for the stage 2. Next slide. So just letting everybody know there's cost to all of this. Laaskwekwe DNA process, July 25 onward, step 1 DNA sampling with willing living participants, storage of genomic information is in a secure database, winter of 25-26, passing the TTS ancestral remains in DNA law, 2026-27, stage 2 exhumation and DNA sampling of Laaskwekwe, storage of genomic information in secure database. So this is if we get consent from everyone, and we'll get to the consent from not only Tecumseh, but the other nations that we are working with. and 2027 onward analysis and identification of close matches. Genealogists work with families to repatriate if possible. And we've also thought of if you cannot identify a match of children, then there is the traditional adoption ceremony that we will need to do for the children so that they have that connection and that home to be. So students, you Salton Tmikias is bloodlines of descendants, blood memory, and that's what our elders have always taught us, that who we are is in our blood. It's our blood memory, and here's the blood lineage that you come from. So that's the closest that our elders, our fluent Secwepemc speakers, have stated is we go to them for all of the Secwepemc that we need to use within our laws and others, and that is what they came back to us and told us this is what we use when our ancestors are found. Then you can tie people who have passed. Next slide. Just wait, I gotta get to the. Okay.
Background, previous DNA consultation. TTS has been preparing for this work for decades. TTS visionary leader Jeanette Jules led consultations with 17th campfires in 1990s towards consensus on proper treatment and scientific study of ancestral remains. Which includes the reburial, repatriation of ancestral remains based on some flaws. The genealogical tracing through DNA testing is widely supported. Scientific study can help us understand more about our ancestors, prove ancestral presence to affirm title and rights, and affirm our oral traditions and different types of DNA testing, DNA profile testing to determine biological relatedness used here, ancestry testing for genetic markers that identify ancient lineages is different. Next slide, please. Do you want to clear that one?
Okay. So this is a map when you go and look at the work that other scientists, so First Nations people in North and South America and around the world are the least studied. So academics around the world are always trying to study Indigenous people. They can't tell you if you're Secwepem, if you're Coast Salish, if you're Blackfoot, if you're Dene, Tlingit, Mohawk. They can only tell you that your haplotype is A, B, C, D, X, and others. So this is a map of North America that shows the haplotype that the scientists look towards. Next slide. So Tecumseh Secwepemc is caretaker of La Esqueque. From the first announcement in May of 2021, TTS made it clear that it has the responsibility to caretaker for the lost children. The responsibility extends to acting as caretaker of the DNA testing process and of the DNA information itself from both willing living participants and the La Esqueque. Both individual and collective Indigenous community nation free prior informed consent apply to how genomic data is used. This caretaker role is responsibility includes developing legal protection for DNA samples and genomic information and in the ancestral remains and DNA law. So the Kamloops Indian Residential School is located right on our Kamloops Indian Reserve lands as defined under the Indian Act. Next menu.
Why a law for DNA? So looking at current legal frameworks for DNA testing and research do not reflect collective rights of Indigenous peoples to genomic data and information. While consent at the individual level is an established standard in law, genomic information is inherently identifiable and shared among families, communities, and nations. The quality of consent may be inadequate because of unauthorized secondary uses. Example, disclosure to law enforcement, commercialization of health data by direct to consumer genetic testing, DTC/GT companies, self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent as minimum human rights standards, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. Next slide, please. Why a law for ancestral remains? Provincial legislation, BC Heritage Conservation Act, denies Indigenous authority over ancestral remains and fails to adequately protect burial places. Indigenous peoples often must fight for recognition of ancestors found within their territories. Example, the Kennewick Man. The history of stolen remains, funerary and ceremonial belongings, knowledge and self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent apply as minimum human rights standards. Next slide, please. Why an ancestral remains and DNA law. Legal protections for DNA samples, genomic information from authorized use and disclosure, Indigenous governance, upholding TITAS, SSN, SQUAMC, and other nations' self-determination and self-governance across territories through distinct structures, occupying the field, developing a first of its kind legal framework and precedent for self-determined protection and management of Indigenous genomic information, improve health equity, ensuring TTES, SQUAMC, and other nations are getting the benefits of the latest genomic health research while exercising data governance and sovereignty. Control the narrative, ensuring identity and belonging is not distorted by the misuse and misinterpretation of DNA. Rather, DNA can assist in articulating SQUAMC histories and who TTIS, SSN, and SQUAMC are according to SQUAMC legal orders. Next slide, please.
Secwepemc law foundations. Indigenous legal orders, Secwepemc principles, procedures, rights, obligations, decision makers, care of ancestors, stewardship of DNA, and citizenship and belonging. Obligations as Yachaminma, caretaker of Secwepemc Uluk and all beings on the land. Kinship ties as the foundation of rights and obligations. Our genealogy connects us to the land, to each other, across families, campfires, caretaker units, and our nation. Secwepemc genealogists are the Kia'as, elder women who hold authority on kinship, Secwepemc legal categories, and processes for DNA and genomic information. Next slide. The next steps for the Esqueque investigation: DNA informed consent, free, prior, informed consent from 4 nations, building informed consent with community and participants. And right now, that's what we're doing, is getting that, and we'll be going out to the 4 nations, to all of the surrounding communities, so that we can show them, here's the informed consent, here's the consent that the individual needs to have, here's the consent that the community needs to know that we're doing, and here's the consent that your nation needs to know that we have, so that there's that protection for everyone. And the DNA law that we're developing, there is no DNA law anywhere else in the world. We've gone out and done the research before we hired our legal team, and they've done the research, and there is isn't anything. There's some policies, but not a law. DNA law, co-design, drafting with legal counsel, knowledge keepers from TTS and the 4 nations. Research agreement, implement sacred covenant through research with the church archives. Forensic studies continuing in 2025, layering data, decision to exhume or not to exhume by TTS and other nations, expert team on ongoing meetings to coordinate interdisciplinary team, and data storage. TTS is exploring ways to implement data sovereignty by hosting all data on its private cloud. Right now, it says 100 terabytes required, or by agreement with trusted partners. And that's something that we're looking at, is who's housed in Canada, what does their intellectual proprietary and copyright stay? Do they recognize OCAP? And we've been working with the Native Biodata Consortium, Joe Yoshida down from Eagle Butte, South Dakota, on the platform that they have on data storage. So either working with him on there or the development of something that's here in BC that we can utilize and then share with other nations across the country. Next slide. Cook's Jam. That is all the work that we've been doing, but the DNA is something that I've really looked at and worked. I did do archaeological work back in the mid-70s, and also have done a lot of the work and study on DNA. I had to teach myself. My oldest son has a metabolic disease, and there are hundreds of metabolic diseases in the world, so they just categorize in one area. He has what's called hereditary fructose intolerance, so he can't have no fructose, sucrose, or sorbitol, which means any kind of sugar. And himself and 2 other people in the world are the only ones who had the genomic marker at the 17th genome. Everyone else had it at the 9th genome. So there are all kinds of different ways of looking at DNA, but it's the protection of it, and that is something that I have thought of for many years. And when everything first started, that is what we discussed, and we discussed that with the 13 grassroots families, and they and chief and council, and they gave a recommendations document to council and to our membership, and everyone approved that. It is where we can, we repatriate the children home. Where they can't be identified, then we do an adoption ceremony. And so when you look at the piece that was talked about on the strontium, and when you're doing the skeleton analysis, British Columbia, during the Water Sustainability Act that Canada was pushing across the country, British Columbia did the isotope analysis of each of the rivers in British Columbia. So that's one other way besides the rock of looking at where a child is from. We could say, in the end, if you can't find a genetic match to a family, you can say that they're Intlakappamp or Stetliamp or Sealk or Sawatm, and about which river that they were closest tied to. So Yurish Jux, Cook's Jam, for listening to us and us being able to share the work that we're doing.
Hey, thank you, Jeanette and Thomas. That was really interesting, and you know, I'll probably have a couple of questions as we move along, and but you know, the information you provided, is certainly so important, because I think a lot of questions will come out from the various communities that are conducting that search. They may not be as far along as as you are, but you know, the information you have will be really important when they get to that stage or phase of that search. So I just want to thank you for your presentation. I want to thank Dr. Emily Holland for her presentation and sharing a little bit about the analysis of skeletal remains, perspective and methodology, and also to Dr. Kona Williams for sharing the process of death investigation and roles of forensic pathologists. And at this point in time, you know, I think I'll check and see if there's any questions yet. If not, I may have a few myself. I don't see any on the question yet, but for Emily, I was just sort of curious on, you know, I know you talked about, you know, the age of death, you know, the dental and the cranium and the postcranial sex assessment, those pieces, you know, the children do grow differently. And I know our children that were in residential school, you know, we're starved or there are experiments on. So I was just sort of thinking back of my grandson, who has always been on the top of that growth chart, and he just turned, you know, when he was 12, he was 6 foot, you know, and after that he did slow down, and but I was wondering on a child like that that has that you know, early growth, what would some of the markers be, or what would be some of the indicators of age if it's you know, if the bones are a lot uh, longer or measurements aren't the same as that age group?
Thanks for that question. That's why there's a range of variation, right? So that's why it's important for us to look at the bones in addition to teeth. Teeth will give us a more accurate representation of chronological age, so how old someone is from the time they were born. And then if we looked at, for example, your grandson's teeth, maybe they'll tell us he's around, 10 to 13 years old, but his bones, because he's so tall, might tell us he's 15 to 16, right? So then we could say, okay, maybe he's actually experiencing early growth period. And there are some other bones that we look at to actually identify that growth trajectory associated with puberty, because there's that onset of hormones, and it happens earlier in some kids than others. So there's this movement now in biological anthropology to try to get away from just chronological age and numbers and look at the whole broad development of a person, right? So are they in that growth trajectory associated with puberty, which also tells us some important information about where they are in their life. So your grandson would look tall for his age, but that goes also to the opposite for kids in residential schools. Like you said, Harley, like they were starved. They were not in an ideal living condition. So they might tend to look what we call small for age, right? So they'll be physically smaller than expected given their potential dental age.
Okay, well, thank you. You know, just so I was sort of wondering how that works and falls within, you know, detection of what age and what
Yeah,
some of those
absolutely.
components. So we do have a question. But I'm not young anymore, so I have to take my glasses off to read it. So what is the role of the OCC in the IRS investigation for Dr. Kona, for Kona?
I will thank you for the question, and thank you so much for that last presentation. That was very helpful. And I just want to say, yeah, Wemigwetch, for all the work that you're doing. I'm just sitting here, I had my mouth hanging open the whole time as I was shoveling some food into it. Anyway, to answer the question, the OCC is, so they're in Ontario, there are two branches of death investigation. We work together. So there's the OCC, the Office of the Chief Coroner, and there's the OFPS, the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service. So we work together to do the investigation of death in Ontario. The OCC does, they're responsible for the coronial aspect of that, the legislation, whereas the OFPS, we're the forensic pathologists. There's a big forensic unit in Toronto, and there's multiple regional units, and Sudbury has one of them. And that is where the forensic pathologists work a lot. And in Toronto, a lot of the forensic science happens. So toxicology, biology, genetics and genomics, ballistics. So it's certainly there's a big component of forensic science in Toronto, and then of course with the satellite units. So like I said, we do work together, but we do kind of administer kind of separate parts of the death investigation system.
Okay, thank you, Kona. And I do have a question for Jeanette or Thomas. One of the things that I was sort of thinking about in regards to the DNA analysis and the sampling is, what was your process in informing the community and in creating that understanding or that knowledge of what that is and what the steps were, and then getting their consent, or where is, I guess maybe not only consent, but how did you determine that support from the community? Because I know it's something new, and we're not all very knowledgeable in that area, and some of us are a little bit concerned. So how did you manage that piece to move forward?
We've been talking about it right since 2021, and the ongoing work that we've done with our ancestors on the testing. So back in the 90s, when my late brother went to all 17 communities, and he had my dad and my uncle along with him to interpret, they they explained everything that needed to be done. So when this came up and the work that we needed to do, we already had that consent in place because everybody said, okay, our elders, one of the elders was 102, that was in the group, and getting consensus from all 17 of the Sohotm communities was a feat in itself, because they went individually to each of the communities. Then collectively, all of the elders got together and they met. And then what the work that we've been doing, we've been getting analysis of our ancestors since 1995 on doing that. And we worked with um, Lakehead University. So Dr. Scott Hamilton didn't know that we had worked with Lakehead University since then and gotten all kinds of reports. And so I knew that the testing part was going to take a while. People think, oh, it's like CSI or, FBI or any of them. It is not that. And plus to the experience I had with my oldest son, it took 4 months of testing from every single specialist that you could think of at the BC Children's Hospital. Then they pulled in specialists from across the country, and then they finally came up with a diagnosis at 6 months of here's what he has. But that's when you come and when you're doing DNA analysis and genomic analysis. And then getting this, and I've always explained, because everybody said, Jeanette, you get up and you talk to us about this because you know what you're talking about. We're not listening to these other people because, they talk in their great big words and all of this stuff, but you explain it the way that we need to have it explained to us. Plus, you understand the process. So having that heads up and and then we've been speaking with all of the 4 nations. So with the Intlakapan, there's 17 communities. The Seal have 7. The Sohwapm have 17. The Stetlium, and that's the upper and lower Stetlium, have 18 communities. So, and then we've been working with the Bikani and the Tsutsina and Kanai, because they've come forward, and then Treaty 8 and Treaty 6, just on a lot of because a lot of the people out in that area attended, and they have families missing. So it's something that I've talked to everyone about is the DNA, and we will be getting to the consent form. So we've been working on the consent form since February. It is finally ready to be shared with everyone so that everybody knows here's the informed consent of the individual, but then here's also the consent that you need to have, that when you're signing away your and giving your consent for your own individual, that encompasses your family and your community and your nation. And then in some cases, it's going to be cross nation because we all know the intermarriage of our people across the nations. And especially in the last, 60 years.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. Well, thank you for that. And sounds like, the elders were part of that whole process early on. And I think that's important for most communities because, the elders certainly help support, and when they do support, the families are more, willing to learn and understand and really look at it and see, the importance of it moving forward. So thank you for
Yeah.
that.
We had people wanting to line up right at the beginning to
Yeah.
give their DNA samples, but we said we need it. I told them we need to get this in place before we do that.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I do have another question here for Kona, Dr. Williams. Is there a time limit associated to the required death investigation? For example, IRS deaths from the 1920s, would the OFPS conduct a death investigation?
Hmm. Yeah, so that's actually that was a question that we had as we were, when the news broke about um, you know, the children that the 215 um typically died 50 years and over. Um, if they go through, if there's eh, for us to investigate that, probably wouldn't be, and I don't want to say it like this, but it kind of is true, sort of like what is the value or the utility? Because if this person had died under criminally suspicious or homicidal circumstances, finding a living person who did that is probably not is probably very unlikely. So there was this kind of like 50-year cutoff where anything older than 50 years would then go on to become an archaeological investigation and would not then potentially proceed through the criminal justice system. That being said, the discussions that have been had, we recognize that these deaths are special. This is a system. This is a systematic uh, attempt at eradication of an entire people. And so we have to consider that. And so far, this is something that we will sort of, I don't want to say bend the rules because it's not really set in stone, and each province has their kind of their own definition of what is of recent forensic interest, as we call it, and what is archaeological. But I think those conversations are happening, and that that definition for these cases is changing, and so these ones are very important to our system, and will be treated as such.
Okay, thank you, Kona. And yeah, go ahead, Jeanette.
Keep trying to push the wrong button here. So just on one of the things with Emily and I think Trisha and everybody else with the NAC needs to kind of take a look at is we're looking ahead. Like we're doing what we're doing now, but we're also looking ahead. So if there is the permission from everyone to do an excavation, then that's something that Emily can, in the future, or a group of people can do a piece on, because it will have to be a forensic archaeological dig, and that means total blocking off, no contamination of the site, no contamination of the ancestors that are the children that are found, no cross contamination, no, like that's another piece that we have to plan for. soon as we finish this one piece. We got a whole bunch of pieces, but this is something that the other communities need to start being aware of. They might not even be close to here it is, but that is something. And then it is, here is how we need to guide other people into, the other communities into, here is what you need to start preparing for if and when you get to this point. Because we're at, here is the point we need to be to gather information. Okay, now at the other point, here's the other piece that needs to be done. And they're not cheap.
Thank you, Jeanette. Emily, you have your hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on what Jeanette said and then something Kona said too. You're absolutely correct, Jeanette. You kind of have to think 10 years from now, what is it that you want, right? And this is a conversation we're having in Manitoba as well, because if people want to excavate, they need to think about, well, what are they going to use that information for? Is there some kind of criminal component that they want to investigate, a humanitarian type of investigation that they want to pursue? Then those forensic kind of protocols need to be enacted early on, as do the protocols to protect DNA in the process of excavation. So Jeanette, that's an excellent point. Thank you. And then Kona, I just want to follow up on that death investigation component, because we're in the same kind of difficulty in Manitoba, right? Where we have this expectation of a cutoff of, oh, it's archaeological, but that's not how we're thinking about it, right? With communities, this is recent for them. This is a bigger issue for them. So our Office of the Chief Medical Examiners is working hard to be involved to help facilitate that process for them as well, because it's kind of a gray area for residential schools. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to add is that even though some of the perpetrators may have long since died, the systems that created these schools are very much alive.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Take my glasses off again so I can see. In regards to the isotope analysis, has testing in the provinces and territories across Canada already been conducted, or is this something that is ongoing or needed? And then also it says, Jeanette mentioned that isotope testing in BC rivers has already been done. What about the other provinces and territories? And that's open to anyone that wants to respond.
Can I comment?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
So it varies by province and territory. A lot of the time, the oxygen isotopes that are tested from water to track things like bird migration. So it depends on what kind of research has been done in a province to determine what rivers or lakes have been tested for isotopes, for oxygen especially. So it's an ongoing thing. There is an isotopic map for Canada, but that doesn't mean things like our remote communities in northern Manitoba, that their rivers have been tested, right? So there needs to be a bit more nuance and a bit more detail in the testing that has yet to be done, so that those communities that are very remote, where children were taken from, can be linked into this isotopic map as well. And so my understanding is that it is not complete across Canada. It varies by province and territory, and more work needs to be done.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think we're into the last few minutes here. I just want to give time for our elder Jackie Bouvier to say the closing prayer. But before I pass it on to her, I just want to thank all of you for your presentations and sharing your knowledge with us and your experience and some of the stories that come with it. So it was so meaningful. So thank you for that. So can I get you, Jackie, to say the closing prayer, then I'll wrap up with some housekeeping.
Miosin, kakkiumakaya miik. Manitou susquats, kuitsi higuno. Susquatsi pihtauja. Manitou. kahkeo gayamtik. Ikskita ko kahkeo gigoi. Miasen. Hey, merci, mistu.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for that prayer, and thank you for opening us in a good way and closing these conversations in a good way. Just for final housekeeping, just want to remind everyone that the recording will be available on the NCTR YouTube channel. And certainly go back to the chat line if you need wellness supports, because we have them both listed there, or even take a screenshot of them and if you should require them after the session ends. And I just want to thank everybody for attending and encourage ongoing conversations and learning. And certainly I have a lot of questions still, and I will be phoning to get your thoughts on the different questions I may have. But it's been an honor to moderate this, and thank you all for doing such an incredible job. So thank you very much, and thank everybody who's online.